The first laugh came before the first wall was finished. It cut through the morning like a split log cracking wrong, sharp enough that she froze with the adze halfway through its swing. The sound carried easily across the clearing, bounced off the frost-hard ground, and the bare trunks standing like witnesses around the site. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. There were only 3 men in the valley who laughed like that, loud, careless, certain the world existed to agree with them, and all 3 had cabins built the same way. Square corners, straight walls, roofs pitched like they'd been stamped from the same worn mold. She let the adze fall, slow and controlled, and rested its blade against the stump. Her breath fogged in front of her face, the air already colder than it should have been for that time of year, early cold. The kind that crept in weeks ahead of schedule and settled into the bones as if it planned to stay. "Round," one of them called out, his voice carrying. "She's building it round." Another laugh followed, then a third. Boots crunched over frost as they came closer. No hurry in them. Men who weren't afraid of being late to their own work. She straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt, and finally looked at them. They stood just past the marked circle she'd cut into the earth. Stakes driven at even intervals, a rough ring carved out of stubborn ground. It didn't look like much yet. No walls, no corners, just intention, laid bare where everyone could see it. "Well, I'll be damned," said Caleb Turner, tipping his hat back with one finger. "You finally lost it, Miriam?" She didn't answer right away. She had learned over the last 2 winters. That silence unsettled men like him more than shouting ever could. It left space, and men like Caleb hated empty space unless they could fill it with their own noise. "Square cabins have worked fine since before any of us were born," he went on. "Corners, straight beams, proper roofs. That's how you keep the cold out, not this." He waved vaguely at the circle, like the shape itself offended him. "Looks like a bread oven," another man said, "or a pig pen. Or a grave," the third added, and that one earned a harder laugh from the others. Miriam folded her hands in front of her, fingers stiff from cold and work. She was smaller than all of them, lighter too, but she had stopped measuring herself against men by size long ago. That was a game she'd never win, and she'd learned to stop playing games she couldn't afford to lose. "It's my land," she said finally. Her voice didn't carry like theirs, but it didn't need to. It was steady. "And my wood," Caleb snorted. "And your funeral, come January." She met his eyes then, not with anger, not with fear, with something quieter, colder. "I buried my husband in January," she said. "Cold didn't stop me then." The laughter faltered, just a little, enough that she noticed. They shifted, boots scraping. The wind slid through the trees and found the gap in Miriam's coat, reminding her why she'd started this in the first place. Her old cabin, square like everyone else's, still stood behind her. The logs were decent, the chinking solid enough, but it bled heat through every corner once the real cold set in. Firewood vanished faster than she could split it. Nights grew long, then unbearable. She'd spent too many hours pressed against the stove, counting logs, counting breaths, wondering which would run out first. The idea had come to her the previous winter, during one of those nights, the stove roaring, the corners of the room still holding onto cold like it was something precious, heat pooling in the center, uselessly high near the ceiling, the shape of the room working against her instead of for her. She hadn't said it out loud then, not even to herself, but the thought had stayed. Round holds heat. She'd seen it once before, years ago, passing through a trading settlement farther west, a low circular structure half sunk into the ground, thick walls, no sharp corners, warm inside with half the fire it should have needed. She'd remembered the way the air felt, not hot, but even, like the warmth had nowhere to leak. It wasn't magic. It wasn't cleverness for the sake of being clever. It was geometry. The men didn't see geometry. They saw stubbornness, or foolishness, or a widow who should have known better than to try something new when survival depended on doing what had always been done. "Well," Caleb said after a moment, tugging his coat tighter as the wind picked up. "Don't say we didn't warn you." He turned, the others following, their laughter already picking back up as they walked away. 18 sides would have been better," one of them called over his shoulder. 18, another said. "She'll be lucky if it stands at all." Miriam watched them go until the trees swallowed their shapes and the sound of them faded. Then she bent, picked up the adze, and went back to work. The logs came next, shorter than usual, cut to fit a curve instead of a corner. She took her time with them, testing each one, shaving where needed, checking the fit before committing. It was slower work, harder on the arms, harder on the patience, but every log seated cleanly against the next felt like a small argument answered. By midday, Her shoulders burned, and her hands ached. She stopped only when her stomach forced the issue, leaning against a stump to eat bread and dried apple, watching the low sun creep across the clearing. The circle was visible now, not just marks in the dirt, but a suggestion of walls, a promise of shape. She could already hear the comments that would come once the walls were high enough to be seen from the path. Round cabins don't stack well. Roofs don't sit right without corners. Snow will slide wrong. Wind will tear it apart. She let them talk. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in heavy and low. The light flattened, the air pressing down in that way that meant weather was coming. She worked faster, knowing when to stop, pushed herself, but not foolishly. One bad cut could end the whole project. When the first snow came, thin, dry flakes that hissed when they touched the ground, she packed her tools and went inside the old cabin. She lit the stove, fed it more wood than she wanted to spare, and sat close to it as the cold seeped in around the edges. That night, lying awake under too many blankets, she listened to the wind test the walls. It found every corner, every seam, every weakness. Her husband had used to joke about it. "Corners invite trouble," he'd said once, half asleep. "Wind doesn't know what to do with a circle." She hadn't laughed then. She wasn't laughing now. The next weeks passed in a rhythm that left no room for doubt. Cut, fit, lift, seat. Neighbors slowed when they passed. Some stopped pretending they weren't watching. Others offered advice she didn't ask for. A few offered help she didn't trust. "You'll need a real roof frame," old Jonah said one morning, leaning on the fence line. "Square base makes it easy. Round'll fight you." "I know," she said, not looking up. He grunted. "Suit yourself." By the time the walls reached chest height, the comments had shifted. Less laughter, more confusion. The shape was undeniable now. Solid, thick. Each log leaned slightly inward, not enough to be obvious, but enough that she could feel it working with gravity instead of against it. When the first real cold snap hit, sharp, sudden, the kind that kills weak calves and cracks green wood, she noticed something strange. Standing inside the half-built structure, no roof yet, just walls high enough to break the wind. The air felt different. Still cold, yes, but quieter, less biting. She stood there longer than necessary, hands tucked into her sleeves, feeling the way the wind slid around the outside instead of cutting through. The circle didn't give it corners to grab, no edges to pry apart. That night, back in the square cabin, the stove ate wood like it was starving. Miriam lay awake again, but this time, it wasn't fear that kept her eyes open. It was certainty. By the time the roof went on, a careful lattice of beams radiating from a central ring, each piece measured twice and cut once. The valley had fully turned. Snow stayed on the ground now. The creek ran slower, its edges crusted white. People started coming by for reasons that had nothing to do with laughter. "How's it holding?" someone would ask. "Looks sturdy enough," another would admit, reluctant. Caleb Turner came once, didn't say much, walked a slow circle around the structure, hands on his hips, eyes narrowed. "Different," was all he said before leaving. The day she moved the stove inside was the day the mockery finally stopped, not because anyone admitted she might be right, but because no one could explain why. Standing inside that round space with the fire lit low, it felt warmer than it should have. Even without the door sealed, even with gaps still waiting to be chinked, Miriam felt it in her bones before anyone else dared say it out loud. This winter was going to be different. And when the real cold came, when numbers started to matter, when men began measuring heat instead of guessing, no one in the valley was prepared for what her strange little cabin was about to prove. The first night Miriam slept in the round cabin, the cold tested it like a living thing. It came in slow, patient waves after sunset, pressing down from the hills and draining what little warmth the day had left behind. The sky cleared completely, stars sharp and merciless, the kind of night where sound carried too far and mistakes carried longer. She didn't rush the move. She never rushed anything that mattered. The stove went in first, centered carefully, its pipe rising straight up toward the roof ring she'd built for it. The floor, packed earth layered with stone and clay, held the day's warmth longer than she expected. She noticed it when she knelt to set the fire, the chill coming up slower through her knees than it ever had in the old cabin. That alone made her pause. She lit the fire, small, deliberately small, one split log, then another laid crosswise, letting the flames catch slow and clean. She wanted to see what the cabin did with heat, not drown it in firewood, and tell herself a comforting lie. As the stove warmed, she moved around the interior, checking seams, running her fingers along the chinking she'd packed in tight. No corners, no dead spaces where cold could crouch unseen. The walls curved gently, guiding the eye and, she hoped, the air. By the time she laid out her bedding near the wall, the fire had settled into a steady, quiet burn. Too quiet, she thought at first. In the square cabin, And the stove always roared like it was fighting for its life. Heat surged, then fled, chased by drafts that slipped along the walls and pooled in the corners. You could feel the cold waiting its turn. Here, there was no waiting. The warmth moved differently. She couldn't have explained it to anyone watching, but she felt it all the same. Instead of rising straight up and abandoning her, it spread outward, brushing the walls, circling back. The air didn't feel layered, hot near the stove, cold everywhere else, but blended, like it had been stirred. She sat on her bedding and waited for disappointment. It didn't come. Hours passed. The fire burned down to coals. She added one more log, smaller than she would have dared use before. Then she lay back and listened. The wind found the cabin and failed. She could hear it outside, a low, wandering sound, testing the walls, slipping around the curve with nowhere to latch on. No whistling at corners, no sudden sighs of cold through gaps she'd missed. Her breath slowed. At some point, she slept. When she woke, the light through the small window told her it was still early, pale, cold, the kind of dawn that usually meant misery. She pulled the blanket tighter and waited for the familiar ache in her fingers, the stiffness in her jaw. It wasn't there. She sat up, confused enough that she forgot the fire for a moment. The stove held only embers now, faint red tucked beneath ash. In the old cabin, that would have meant ice on the walls and numbness everywhere else. Here, the air still held warmth, not comfort, not summer, but livable. She swung her legs over the side of the bedding and stood. The floor bit at her feet, but gently, like it had limits. She crossed the room, hand brushing the wall as she went. The logs were cool, not cold. That stopped her. She stood there longer than necessary, palm flat against the curve, letting the truth of it sink in. The wall wasn't stealing heat from her body the way the old cabin's walls always had. It wasn't a drain. It was a boundary. Outside, snow crunched. She froze, heart jumping before sense caught up. Then she heard voices, two of them, men, close. She stepped to the door and opened it a crack. Caleb Turner stood there with another man, Elias Reed from the far end of the valley. Both wore coats pulled tight, breath fogging hard in the cold. "Mornin'," Caleb said, eyeing her, then the door behind her. "Didn't expect you to be up yet." "I live here now," she said. Elias shifted his weight. "Heard you moved in last night." And it got down to near zero before dawn," he said. "Coldest yet." Miriam didn't say anything. Caleb leaned forward slightly, peering past her shoulder into the cabin. "You got the stove going?" "Had it going," she said. He frowned. "Had." Silence stretched. The wind slipped between them and moved on, frustrated. Elias cleared his throat. "Mind if we step inside a minute?" She hesitated just long enough that they noticed, not because she feared what they'd see, but because once they saw it, there would be no taking it back. Then she stepped aside. The change was immediate. Both men sucked in a breath as they crossed the threshold, eyes flicking instinctively to the stove. Caleb reached out, palm hovering near the wall without touching it. "Feels wrong," he said finally. "Wrong how?" Miriam asked. "Like it should be colder." Elias took a slow step forward, then another, turning in place. "Heat's even," he muttered. "No cold pockets." Caleb scowled. "You burn all night?" "One log after midnight," Miriam said. Elias swore under his breath. They stood there longer than politeness allowed, neither willing to be the first to leave. Finally, Caleb nodded once, sharp and reluctant. "Must be the way the walls block the wind," he said, already building an explanation he could live with. "Maybe," Miriam said. They left soon after, boots crunching faster than before. Word spread the way it always did in the valley, not as excitement but as irritation. Something didn't fit, and people hated that. Within days, others came. Not to laugh, to feel. They stood awkwardly near the door, hands shoved into pockets, pretending they weren't measuring the air with every breath. Some asked questions, some didn't. No one mocked anymore. Then came the night the temperature dropped hard and fast. The kind of cold that doesn't creep, it falls. The sky clouded over late afternoon, then cleared after dark, trapping the cold close to the ground. Trees cracked softly in the distance. The creek went silent. Miriam fed the stove as she had the night before. No more, no less. She slept deeply. The next morning, smoke hung over the valley like a low fog. Not drifting, not moving, just there. People were already outside when she stepped out of her cabin. Faces pinched, movements stiff. Wood piles noticeably smaller than the day before. She saw Caleb splitting logs with more force than necessary. Elias stood nearby, rubbing his hands together, eyes on the round cabin. "What did it hit?" Miriam asked, keeping her tone neutral. Caleb paused. 18 below, he said. "At my place." Elias nodded. "Same at mine." Miriam waited. Caleb looked at her, jaw tight. "You check yours?" She nodded once. 0. The word landed heavier than she expected. 0? Elias repeated. "Inside," she clarified. At dawn, silence stretched again, longer this time. "That's not possible," Caleb said flatly. "It is," she replied. "I wrote it down." That's when the measuring began. Not that day. Pride still held strong. But the next, and the next after that. Men who'd scoffed at thermometers before suddenly trusted numbers more than instincts. They came with their own instruments, cheap and mismatched, hung them on her walls, set them by the stove, watched the mercury climb. They compared it to their own cabins, same fire, same wood, same night. The difference stayed. 15 degrees, 16, then 18. By the end of the week, no one was laughing anymore. But the cold wasn't finished with the valley, and as the winter deepened, the round cabin would stop being a curiosity and start becoming something far more dangerous, a comparison. The cold stopped being a visitor and settled in like it owned the place. By midwinter, the valley no longer spoke in forecasts or guesses. Everything was numbers now. How many logs burned a night, how low the creek had dropped beneath its ice, how many degrees you lost between sunset and dawn. Men who'd once judged weather by smell and wind direction now argued over thermometers like they were scripture, and Miriam's round cabin had become the reference point no one wanted to acknowledge. At first, people tried to explain it away. "It's newer wood," someone said. "Walls are thicker," another insisted. "She's got the stove set just right." Miriam didn't correct them. She didn't offer theories or lessons. She simply lived in the cabin and kept notes the way she always had, quietly, carefully, without flair. Temperatures at dawn, amount of wood burned, wind direction, snow depth. Patterns emerged whether anyone wanted them to or not. On the coldest mornings, when breath froze in beards and children cried from the shock of air on bare skin, Miriam's cabin held steady, not warm exactly, but survivable, without desperation. She could sit at her small table without gloves. She could sleep through the night without waking to feed the stove every 2 hours. The fire burned slower, steadier. Like the cabin itself, refused to let the heat escape all at once. Corners, she thought again, or the lack of them, the men noticed first. Pride or not, it was easier to admit a structure worked than to admit a widow had outthought them. They came by, under the pretense of checking her chimney, her roof beams, the way the snow slid off her walls instead of piling and freezing into heavy, dangerous shelves. Snow didn't cling to the round cabin the way it did to the others. It slipped, slow and constant, falling evenly around the perimeter instead of building weight in corners and valleys. More than once, Miriam woke to the sound of a heavy thud outside, the night shedding itself from her walls. Meanwhile, square roofs sagged. One afternoon, a sharp crack echoed across the valley. Not wood splitting for the stove, but something structural, saw breaking under strain. By evening, everyone knew whose cabin it was, Jonah's. The roof beam had bowed too far under the weight of packed snow and ice. It didn't collapse entirely, but it shifted enough to open gaps. Wind rushed in like it had been waiting for permission. By nightfall, Jonah and his wife were burning through wood at twice their usual pace, trying to keep the cold at bay while they debated what to do. Miriam didn't offer help, not because she was cruel, but because she knew how offers were heard. Pity sounded too much like triumph, and she wanted neither. She stayed inside, tending her fire, listening as the wind rose again. Near midnight, there was a knock, not loud, not demanding, just hesitant enough to make her pause. She opened the door to find Jonah standing there alone, hat pulled low, his shoulders hunched like he was already apologizing. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she replied. He didn't ask to come in, didn't need to. The warmth spilled out the open door like a confession. "My place, it's not holding," he said. "Just till morning, my wife." Miriam stepped aside. He entered slowly, eyes adjusting, the tension in his posture easing despite himself. He exhaled hard, like he'd been bracing for something he no longer had to fight. "She can have the bedding," Miriam said. "I'll take the chair." Jonah shook his head. "I won't." "You will," she said, "or you'll leave." That settled it. Word spread quietly after that. Not dramatic, not loud, just one fact layered on top of another until it became unavoidable. The round cabin wasn't a novelty. It was insurance. By the next week, people stopped pretending they were just curious. They started asking real questions. "How'd you set the roof beams? How thick are the walls? Is the floor insulated?" Miriam answered when she could. When she couldn't, she said so. She didn't dress it up or simplify it for comfort. "It's not magic," she told them. "It's shape and patience." Some nodded, some frowned. Caleb Turner came last. He didn't knock. He stood outside long enough that she noticed him through the window, then finally cleared his throat like he was announcing himself to a room that already knew he was there. She opened the door. "You were right," he said immediately, as if speed would dull the weight of the words. She waited. "I measured it myself," he continued. "Same fire, same wood, same night, 18 degrees difference by dawn." "And?" Miriam asked. And I don't like not understanding why. She studied him for a long moment. Caleb wasn't stupid. He was stubborn, and those two things often traveled together, but they weren't the same. Come in, she said. They sat near the stove, not facing each other directly. Men like Caleb did better when they didn't feel cornered. Corners, he muttered, staring into the fire as if the answer might rise from it. She allowed herself the smallest smile. He ran a hand through his hair. You think it'd work bigger? Bigger how? Family cabin? 2 rooms? Storage? She considered. It changes things. More openings. More chances for heat to escape. But still round, he pressed. Yes, she said, still round. That winter didn't ease. If anything, it worsened. Another roof failed, not fully, but enough to force repairs in the cold. Another family burned through their reserves weeks early. Children developed coughs that lingered, their small bodies struggling to keep up. And through it all, Miriam's cabin held, not untouched, not perfect, but stable. By late winter, the mockery had reversed into something more dangerous than laughter, resentment. Not everyone could rebuild. Not everyone had the strength, the land, or the time. And those who couldn't began to look at the round cabin not as a clever solution, but as a quiet accusation. She felt it in the way conversations stopped when she approached, in the way people counted her logs when she passed, in the way help was offered less freely than before. Survival sharpened envy. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills, Miriam stood outside her cabin and looked across the valley. Smoke rose unevenly now. Some fires burned hard and desperate. Others had gone out too early. She knew then that the round cabin had changed more than temperatures. It had changed balance, and balance, once shifted, rarely returned without consequence. The cold still had weeks left in it, and before winter released its grip, the valley would be forced to decide whether Miriam's cabin was something to learn from or something to blame. By the time the snow began to yellow at the edges from ash and tracked dirt, the valley had divided itself without ever saying so out loud. There were those who counted Miriam's cabin as a lesson, and there were those who counted it as an insult. The cold lingered longer than anyone remembered it ever doing. March came and went without mercy. Night still dropped hard enough to freeze a bucket solid if it was forgotten outside. Days warmed just enough to make the cold feel personal, like it was teasing the idea of relief without delivering it. Wood piles shrank, tempers followed. Miriam noticed the change in smaller ways first. Fewer greetings on the path, conversations that turned low when she passed, a question left unanswered a second too long. She had expected some of it. Survival did that to people. It made comparisons unavoidable. Every extra degree of warmth became a quiet verdict. She stayed careful, shared when asked, never bragged, never counted what others lacked. Still, resentment has a way of growing even when it isn't fed. The first accusation came wrapped in concern. You sure that stove's safe? Elias asked one morning, standing near her door without stepping inside. Burns awful clean for so little wood. Miriam looked at him evenly. Same stove I've always had? Draft's different, he said. Might be pulling heat wrong, or smoke. It's pulling air evenly, she replied. That's the point, he frowned, unsatisfied. Just be careful. The second accusation came sharper. You hiding extra insulation in the walls? A man asked her near the creek. Something none of us can get? No, she said. Then what? She didn't answer. Not because she couldn't, but because she'd learned that explanations didn't land the same once people decided they didn't want to hear them. By the time spring should have arrived, the valley was exhausted. People were tired of counting logs, tired of waking to frozen water, tired of pretending this winter was like any other. That's when the storm came. It didn't announce itself with wind or snow at first. It arrived quietly, under a heavy sky that pressed low and grey for 2 days straight. No sun, no warmth, just a stillness that felt wrong. On the third night, the temperature dropped faster than it had all season. Miriam felt it before she saw it. The air inside her cabin tightened like it was bracing. She fed the stove earlier than usual, then sat awake longer than she meant to, listening. The wind rose after midnight, not gusts, pressure, a steady force that leaned against the valley and refused to let go. Snow followed, heavy and wet at first, then dry and sharp as the cold deepened. By dawn, the world had vanished. Drifts piled high against doors, roofs sagged under fresh weight, paths disappeared completely, erased in a single night. Miriam dug her door free carefully, shovel biting into packed snow that had frozen mid-fall. When she stepped out, the sound shocked her. Nothing. No wind, no voices, no animals, just the dull, heavy silence of a place buried alive. She worked methodically, clearing enough space to breathe, to move. Smoke rose straight from her chimney, thin and steady. Across the valley, chimneys struggled. Some smoked low and dirty, draft fighting itself. Others didn't smoke at all. She felt the pull then, the knowledge that came with being the warmest place in a freezing valley. She hadn't asked for it, but it had found her anyway. The first knock came before midday, then another, then more. People arrived in pairs at first, then in small groups, faces red and raw, eyes scanning her cabin with something close to desperation. Some asked outright, some didn't ask at all, just stood there until she spoke. She took in who she could, one family at a time. Women and children first. Older men who couldn't keep warm in their own homes. Her cabin filled with breath and movement, and the sound of life pushing back against the cold. She adjusted the fire, careful not to overfeed it. The room held steady. No one said 18 degrees out loud. They didn't need to. By evening, word had spread farther than her walls could reach. Someone pounded on her door hard enough to rattle the latch. She opened it to find Caleb Turner, snow packed into his beard, eyes sharp with something between fear and anger. "You can't take everyone," he said without greeting. "I'm not," she replied. "You'll freeze us out," he said. "Make us look like fools." She stared at him. "The cold's doing that just fine on its own." He stepped closer. "You built this knowing it'd put us in this position." "No," she said. "I built this so I wouldn't die." The people inside her cabin went quiet. Caleb glanced past her, saw them, children wrapped in borrowed blankets, a woman rocking a baby close to the stove. His jaw tightened. "This isn't how things are done," he said. "This isn't a normal winter," Miriam replied. He held her gaze longer than was comfortable. Then he turned and left, disappearing into the snow without another word. That night, the storm pressed harder. Roofs creaked, doors froze shut. A chimney collapsed somewhere to the west with a dull, distant thud. Miriam didn't sleep. She tended the fire, watched the walls hold, felt the shape of the cabin doing exactly what she'd built it to do. The heat moved in a slow, patient circle, touching everyone in turn, refusing to pool or flee. By morning, the valley was changed. 2 cabins had partially collapsed. One family had abandoned their home entirely, huddled now in a neighbor's barn. Another man had lost fingers to frost while trying to clear his roof in the dark. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, it left behind something heavier than snow. It left proof. People walked the valley with different eyes now. They counted damage, they counted loss, and they counted the one place that had held without strain. No one laughed anymore. No one accused her of cheating. Instead, they asked a different question. Why hadn't we listened? Miriam stood outside her cabin at dusk, watching the light return to the hills, knowing the hardest part wasn't surviving the winter. It was what came after, when people decided what to do with the truth they could no longer ignore. The round cabin had saved lives, but it had also broken something the valley had lived with for generations. And once broken, it wouldn't be put back the same way. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in the way the cold had, slow, testing, unwilling to promise anything it couldn't keep. The snow softened first, not melted, just weakened, its surface turning grainy beneath the sun before freezing hard again at night. Water ran under the crust in quiet channels, unseen but relentless. Roofs shed their weight in uneven sheets that thudded into the drifts below. The valley smelled different, wet earth trapped under months of ice. Smoke that no longer clung as desperately to the air. People came out of their homes like survivors of something unnamed. They moved carefully at first, as if the ground itself might betray them. Damage revealed itself in stages. A bowed beam here, a split wall there, cabins that had made it through winter but would not survive another without repairs. Miriam watched it all without comment. Her cabin stood as it had through the worst of it. The roof true, the walls unshifted, the earth-packed floor still firm beneath her feet. When she opened the door each morning, the air inside never shocked her body the way the old cabins had. Even now, with the stove burning lower, the space held on to warmth longer than it should have. The numbers were still written in her notebook. She hadn't stopped recording them. 18 degrees. That figure followed her through the valley like a rumor that refused to fade. People didn't gather in groups to talk about it. They spoke in pairs, in low voices, in half sentences. They weighed what they'd seen against what they'd believed all their lives. Square cabins had been law without ever being written down, passed from father to son, neighbor to neighbor. Corners meant strength, straight lines meant order. Anything else was wasteful or foolish. Now there was proof, measured, repeated, undeniable, that the law had been incomplete. That kind of truth made people uncomfortable. Caleb Turner didn't come to her again right away. When he did, it wasn't in anger, it was with a plan. He waited until the afternoon, when the sun was high enough to soften the cold but not warm it away. Miriam was repairing a section of chinking where the freeze had pulled clay loose. She heard him before she saw him, his footsteps slow, deliberate, not trying to surprise her. "I want to build another one," he said when she straightened. She turned to face him, hands still dusty with clay. "Another what?" "A round cabin," he said. "Mine, for next winter." She studied him longer than was polite. "You won't like it," she said. He snorted once. "I didn't like this one either." "That's not what I mean," she replied. "It's slower, harder. You'll have to cut differently, think differently." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it all winter." She waited. "I lost half my wood," he added. "Burned it just trying to keep the place livable. My roof nearly went. If that storm had lasted another day—" He stopped there. She nodded once. "If you build it right. I want you to show me," he said. "Not tell me, show me." That was new. Others followed, though none asked as directly. Jonah was first, then Elias. Then two younger men who had spent the winter hauling water and splitting wood for their families until their hands cracked and bled. They didn't ask for permission. They asked for guidance. Miriam agreed, but on her terms. She didn't draw plans. She didn't measure for them. She made them work. She had them mark circles in the dirt, drive stakes, stretch lines. She made them cut logs too short and then recut them properly. She showed them how small errors multiplied in a curve, how a lazy cut could throw the whole structure off if it wasn't corrected early. Some quit. They didn't say why, but she could see it in their faces. The shape demanded more thought than they were willing to give. Corners were easier. Corners forgave mistakes by hiding them. A circle remembered everything. Those who stayed learned. They learned how the roof beams needed to lean inward just enough to support each other, how the walls should thicken toward the base, how doors and windows had to be placed carefully, not out of convenience but balance. They learned that building a round cabin wasn't about copying Miriam's work. It was about understanding it. By the time the ground softened enough to dig properly, 3 new circles had appeared in the valley. They didn't look identical. Miriam wouldn't have allowed that even if they'd tried. Each reflected the hands that built it, their strengths, their habits, their compromises. But all of them shared the same refusal to give the cold, easy access. The resentment faded slowly. Not completely. It never does. Some people still looked at Miriam like she'd upset something sacred. Others resented that she hadn't shared the idea sooner, as if survival were a communal obligation she'd somehow neglected. She accepted neither blame nor praise. She had built what she needed to live. The valley adjusted around that fact. By summer, the old square cabin behind her had become storage. She walked through it once, late in the season, dust motes floating in the stale air. She stood in the corner where she'd once slept wrapped in blankets, feeding the stove through the night, listening to the wind slip in through seams she'd never been able to seal. She closed the door behind her without ceremony. The round cabin wasn't perfect. It required attention, maintenance, thought, but it had done what nothing else in the valley had managed that winter. It had made the cold predictable. That alone changed everything. When the first frost of the next year came early again, lighter but unmistakable, no one laughed. They checked their walls, they checked their roofs, and some of them walked the curve of their new cabins with hands pressed flat to the logs, feeling for leaks that weren't there. Miriam stood outside at dawn, breath rising steady in the cool air, and watched smoke rise evenly across the valley. Not desperation, just preparation. 18 degrees had been the difference between surviving and enduring, between burning everything you had and keeping something back, between fear and choice. The valley would remember that long after the winter itself was forgotten.